Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the to our next speaker for the environmental justice guest lecture and speaker series. We are not immigrants, unsettling Asians in America. Please bear with me as I try to share my screen really quickly. Awesome. Okay. Sorry, could y'all confirm again if you can see the screen one more time? All good? Okay, perfect. Just to reiterate, welcome and thank you for coming to tonight's Environmental Justice Guest Lecture and Speaker Series entitled We Are Not Immigrants, Unsettling Asians in America. Let me see here. Okay, so a little background on the Amado Kaya Initiative. AKI is a BIPOC-led project which advances the commitments of the late social justice activist and community organizer, Amado Kaya Canam Rodriguez. He died at 22 years old in 2020 after supporting an indigenous group in the Philippines suffering from losses due to typhoons. AKI continues his legacy by disseminating indigenous, land-based decolonial knowledge and promoting individual and collective healing, transformation, and liberation. So one of those projects is this guest lecture series hosted by AKI in collaboration with the Asian American Seed Stewards at UC Davis. So the title of this series, We Are Not Immigrants, Unsettling Asians in America, is inspired both by Hawaiian sovereignty activist and professor of Hawaiian studies, Haunani K. Trask's poem, Settler Not Immigrants, as well as Native American studies scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. So the series hosts lectures and conversations with Asian American and other scholars and activists of color who write about or are actively resisting white settler colonialism in California and beyond through work with indigenous communities, environmental justice, and or land stewardship. It also holds space for Asian American identified folks, the main audience for AKI and the Asian American Seed Stewards, to listen and learn from indigenous peoples, to encourage us to challenge and resist our complicities with white settler colonialism as residents on Turtle Island. And now I will introduce our speaker for today. Oh, wait, sorry, one more slide. So the series is still running into the end of June with specific dates and speaker information to be announced periodically. So please be sure to follow us on IG at Amado Kaya and subscribe to our newsletter at amadokaya.org. Sorry, there should be a K in that link to stay updated. If you like this series and want more, please consider supporting us by donating. Donations allow us unrestricted funding to continue our programming in environmental justice, indigenous solidarity, and more, especially in the context of AB 715, which is being challenged as we speak. I highly encourage y'all to learn more about that and take action because it has very serious consequences for ethnic studies and just knowledge and histories of people of our different communities. And these links and information will be shared, including the recording of this lecture afterwards. So be sure to follow us so that you can stay updated. And now finally, I will introduce our speaker for today, Duan Jian, who will discuss Asian American diasporic food sovereignty and decomposition as liberation. So Duan Jian is a sixth-generation Chinese settler on Turtle Island, born and raised within the small corner of Ramaytush Ohlone territory, known to many as San Francisco. As a little kid in a big city, Duan Jian received their first lessons in ecology from observing how their beloved home communities cultivated symbiotic webs of care, resilience, and self-defense in the face of relentless gentrification. Now, as a budding land worker and plant companion, Duan Jian draws from the lessons of their urban Asian American upbringing to think about strategies for decomposing settler colonialism and critically re-engaging with ancestral ecologies. And with that, I will now pass it on to Duan Jian.
Thank you. I'm just gonna get the slides ready. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to attend and be here. Ooh, there's a lot going on, hold up. Let me see what this is at. Okay, can everybody see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, and special thank you to people who are joining on a time difference. I see some friends on here who have, quite a big time difference. So love to y'all. So today, as mentioned, I'm going to be giving a little talk on Asian American diasporic food sovereignty and decomposition as liberation. And I will break down these terms as we go along as well. And so first, I just wanted to go over a little agenda so people have a roadmap for where we're going to. So I'm going to talk about some personal and research background just to kind of give you all a sense of where I'm coming from. Going to talk through Asian American food sovereignty as I'm defining it, talk a little bit about what it means to think of plants as kin and multi-species diaspora and ecocultural belonging, then talk a little bit more about settler responsibility and cover crop futures before moving into some key takeaways. And yeah, chat, feel free to throw anything in as we're going through this. And also if you need help like volume or speed, throw that in and then maybe moderators can help, yeah, bring that to my attention as well. So we'll dive into it. Okay, so personal background. I was born and raised in Ramaytush Ohlone territory, currently known as San Francisco or Frisco, the SFC, depending on your persuasion. I'm a sixth generation Toisanese and Chinese settler in Turtle Island with distant Dutch American ancestry and a large multiracial extended family. And I just bring that up to talk about the fact that the way that I think through my settler responsibilities has to do a lot with kind of my extended kinship and the larger, I guess, blood community that I'm connected with. I'm a recent graduate, undergraduate student of Brown University, and I was involved in community gardening and urban farms throughout childhood in San Francisco. If anyone watched the last lecture speaker from Hummingbird Farms, I was part of like the Common Roots Youth Program that they mentioned, which worked on some of the community gardening projects around here. But I started working more with some rural BIPOC farms and land projects in 2021 after starting college. And so moving into that, oh, cool. So the project that I've been working on for the past 2 years, which has kind of concluded its current stage, was 2 years of kind of ethnographic, mostly interview and some site visit research with Asian American farmers, the majority of whom were young, college educated, and first generation, meaning that their parents were not farming when they were growing up or they didn't grow up on a farm environment. And about 3/4 of them identified as queer or trans. Over 50% identified as multiracial, Asian, and white. I'm not going to like go too deep into these kind of demographic categories in this talk, but if people have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or yeah, I can talk more about that another in another talk. But the other thing that I really focused on was folks who are growing diasporic Asian heritage crops as they define them. And so through this kind of research process, I was kind of guided by the questions of what is an ancestral knowledge or legacy and inheritance, and how do we know that we are finding or approaching it? What does quote unquote culturally significant mean in the context of crops? And does it feel different to farm something that we consider culturally significant than something that we don't consider to be culturally significant? And what does food or seed sovereignty mean to you as a farmer? Okay, so to start off, how am I defining Asian American food sovereignty? So I kind of broke it down into both like institutions and ideology that I saw connecting this loose network, but like definitely growing community of folks who both are Asian American and explicitly align themselves with food sovereignty as a larger, like a global movement, right? And so some institutions that are identifiable are like Second Generation Seeds, which is based in California, Troy Commons, based in the Hudson Valley of New York, the UC Davis Asian American Seed Stewards Program, who's one of the sponsors of this lecture series, and Asian American Farmers Alliance, which is a kind of remote advocacy group of Asian American farmers, and then a lot of individual farms who are affiliated with these other institutions, either through kind of seed saving networks or through educational programs or because they were trained on farms that were associated with these programs, right? And so I'm seeing this as this kind of growing network. On the other hand, a lot of these folks are united by kind of common values and practices relating to food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, are almost all small scale sustainable agriculture, and they kind of aspire towards practicing agroecology, which is the idea of doing agriculture in an ecological way, in a way in which you are not just, doing plantation monocultures of the same crop in rows, but actually thinking about how different crops and pollinators and in the whole ecosystem works together to produce food. They were all kind of self-narrating themselves as engaging in diasporic cultural reclamation of usually what they would call ancestral or traditional ecological knowledge. And most of them explicitly espouse kind of decolonial and anti-imperialist politics. A lot of them have been very outspoken recently about the genocide in Palestine and have aligned themselves with these kind of larger movements that expand beyond the food system, right? Um, so next, I'm kind of just break down real quickly, like what it looks like for us and especially farmers to think of plants as kin, and what does it mean for Asian Americans to acknowledge our diaspora as more than just human, and how do we start to navigate belonging as something that is ecocultural, right? Both ecological and cultural, rather than just cultural. So one of my collaborators who I interviewed had this quote that I thought was really powerful, where they said, while they were farming, I would put my face into a flowering ginger plant. The smell reminded me of the tangyuan my grandmother would make. Food was an expression of love from my grandmother, and this gave me a feeling of home. I was seeing my grandmother all around me, as rain, as soil, in the plants, in the butterflies. And they're talking about a grandmother who had recently passed as well. That's important context. And so both the interviews I had with the farmers that I was working with, as well as kind of the literature that was being put out by some of the kind of members of this Asian American food sovereignty movement, as I'm describing it, would point towards this notion that plants are ancestors and relatives. So Kristen Leach has this article in Mold Magazine where she writes, plants are another type of ancestor for us. When imagination is tethered to love, care, and deep relationships, that's when the possibilities become endless. To be allowed entry into this history and to then think about what you want to leave behind is an incredible position to be in. Specifically in this moment, given how wild the state of the world is, that kind of imagination is essential to fostering hope moving forward, right? So there's a very explicit political orientation towards this work of food sovereignty and seed saving, right? And so I think about how when we're talking about more than human kinship, I want us to be very specific about what kinship actually means, rather than just kind of this feeling of affection or closeness or affinity. Kinship is really a system for organizing obligations and responsibilities to one another, and it facilitates moral and material relationships of care, right? So it actually has to do with what do we think we owe to one another, and how are resources that we share with one another structured by the things that we're calling kinship. And because kinship has become such a common term, I think it's important for us to ground it in like what does that actually look like on a concrete everyday level, rather than just kind of an affective or like sentiment of like how do we care for one another. And so this always brings up the complicated question of like where do we draw the boundaries of kinship? Like who's deserving of our care, and who do we decide to share resources with and feel a sense of responsibility or obligation to? And when I say who, I really mean that in an expansive sense of both humans and more than humans. Um, and so there was another kind of quote from one of my collaborators that I thought spoke to this issue a little bit, where they said, seeds don't belong to us. We're not entitled to them. Even if they're associated with a certain culture, it doesn't make them exclusively of that culture. We are informed by the plants and seeds more so than they are informed by us. And this collaborator kind of also shared with me along this topic that bitter melon, which has become a very symbolic kind of food for a lot of diasporic Asian communities, actually originates in Africa, right? And that there are a lot of cultures and diasporic communities beyond Asian Americans who have an affinity with bitter melon, and that we have to be kind of careful about claiming ownership or territory over certain plants and seeds, right? And so another thing that comes up for me as our movement is growing, as we are making contact with strangers and with people who are beyond just face-to-face networks, like if our plants and seeds are our kin and we think of them as such, what does it mean to commodify them, to be able to buy and sell them for the sake of our movement work? And I'm not trying to say this as like a gotcha. Like I actually think this is a complicated question of how do we expand our movement and understand how the market poses another influence. And how do we, as we're building seed and food sovereignty, not relinquish sovereignty to the power of the market, in the sense of like who is able to buy our seeds? Like if it's public, then people who are not Asian American, people who have more capital and resources than us are also able to, take part in this, in this cultural kind of practice that we're promoting. And so what places and peoples do plants and seeds belong with, and who has the right to decide? That's, an ongoing question. And of course, we know like these are very tied to questions of power. Um, so another thing that a collaborator said to me that I think resonates with this question is there's no such thing as purity exactly with categories or phrases like culturally significant or heritage. That's really like a placeholder for something that's steeped in relationship, but not necessarily a genetic purity or ancestral lineage that is not ultimately connected to any stories of migration or movement. Because all seeds have moved and migrated, and that is really the history of imperialism and colonialism that they reveal. But I think that's the important or the beautiful part about farming, that it can trouble categories that we want so badly to be stable. And so I'm drawing from this post that you can find on Instagram from Troy Commons, where they talk about how I'm not going to read through this whole quote, but I'll kind of give the gist where like a lot of Asian Americans have grown up first experiencing this kind of pressure to assimilate and then feeling this sense of disappointment when it doesn't actually lead towards the self-actualization or the sense of belonging that it promises, right? And so this kind of unlearning of the American dream. Um, and at the same time, to be in the Asian diaspora and to be an Asian American often means kind of finding yourself in community with folks who are substantially different from yourself, but because of the kind of ignorance of broader society and because of how diverse the Asian diaspora is, you kind of collapse these differences and belong with folks who you have painful histories with and who, at the same time, like we have distinct cultural and ecological places of home, whether here in the diaspora or in the quote unquote homeland, right? And so one of the tensions of kind of what I was talking about before is when we talk about, cultural heritage crops, like what are the categories of cultural heritage? Like, is it on the level of a country and a nation state? Is it the level of a geographic community? Is it, how are we defining these things? And so I'm going to move forward and just, yeah, get into some more. So Jacqueline Moyer, who I also incorporated into my project, has a memoir that I really encourage everyone to read. It's very, I think, accessible and also just speaks to so many of these questions. It's called On Gold Hill. And in the book, she has a quote that says, "In botany, there is a term for a plant's dispersal unit, such as this spikelet, a diaspore. A diaspore, which shares a root, of course, with the root diaspora, consists of both the seed itself and additional material designed to aid in dispersal, a tail to catch the wind, a sticker to cling to an animal's fur. Within this unit exists two distinct yet essential functions of survival, the capacity for movement and the ability to root." And so for me, as I'm talking about multi-species diaspora, I'm really interpreting these plant that we consider our kin and our ancestors to be these companions that give us this ability to root in some ways, right? Like having familiar foods and having familiar landscapes is one of the ways that people find home in a new place that is unfamiliar to them. But there's some thorny contradictions here, right? And so for me, the first one that I was thinking through is that resisting assimilation is necessary for cultural survival. Like just, acquiescing to white supremacy is not the way. But reclaiming culture is also very difficult. Authenticity is always relative, and the labels we use for ourselves, whether Asian diasporic or Asian American, or defining ourselves by nation, state, or region, like, you know, the Philippines, China, India, or even South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, these are more determined by the need for public recognition and coalition building than their cultural or ecological specificity. We know that when a lot of folks first migrated to the United States in the histories of Asian American migration, they did not identify with these larger terms. A lot of people identified with their hometown or their very specific region that was familiar to them ecologically. And so the terms that we use today are much broader than the scope of lived experience. And so how do we resolve this problem of scale and efficacy when we're talking about Asian American food sovereignty, when we're talking about our cultural heritage? Like, what is a Chinese crop or what is a South Asian crop? Like, those are huge categories that don't align ecologically and in terminology. The second part is this idea that places are made of plants, right? So cultivating kinship with plants certainly strengthens our ability to root here in the diaspora in the face of racial exclusion from national belonging. But at the same time, our diasporic plant kin are settlers as well. And what is their responsibility to the indigenous territories and ecosystems they arrive in? And how do they transform these places that they arrive in through their chemical, biological, geological interaction with the environments that they're in? And third, our cultural, political, and ecological conditions in the diaspora are very different from the homeland. Many of us have mixed heritage and can't trace our ancestral lineage to one singular point of origin or homeland. So there's not really a return to a pristine past before migration or colonization. With that in mind, what are the futures that we have to nurture here without an ability to simply resuscitate the past? And so, how do we make meaning of these complex realities in order to effectively strategize for how to build and grow our movement, right? Like, I don't want to have these complications also lead to immobility and the inability for us to organize and move forward. And so, for me, part of the answer comes around defining home ecoculturally, right? So, a home is not only a place where we live, but it's also a place where we die. And not only a place where we die, but where we can decompose and nourish future generations of human and more than human life, right? So we want to think about this as this cycle. All of us come from a place and all of us have to return to a place, and all of us are made up of the nutrients that we have kind of accumulated through the process of metabolizing. And when I say all of us, again, I'm not just talking about humans, but also our plant companions and these crops that we're cultivating. And so what are we thinking about in future generations of how are these diasporic companions also going to return to the soil eventually? So this gets into what I'm calling settler responsibility and cover crop futures. And so looking into kind of some indigenous studies scholars, there's some definitions of settler ecologies that I think are really important for us to think through as folks who are settlers doing land-based work. So in Settler Cannabis by Caitlin Reed, Caitlin says, what makes an ecology a settler colonial one is when those waves of settlement seek to incise their own ecologies required for their societies to survive and flourish in the landscapes they seek to occupy permanently on lands already stewarded and governed by indigenous peoples. And Stephen Newcomb, who, by the way, is not himself indigenous, writes, the term colonization is derived from the Latin colere, to till, cultivate, farm land. Thus, colonization can be thought of in terms of the steps involved in a process of cultivation, taking control of the indigenous soil, uprooting the existing indigenous plants or peoples, overturning the soil, the indigenous way of life, transplanting or planting new colonial seeds, people, or transplanting colonial plants, people from another environment, and harvesting the resulting crops, resources, or else picking the fruits, wealth that result from the labor of cultivation, colonization. And when I was reading these, I think there's some nuance there, but I was struck by how resonant they felt with me of how we're going about this process of kind of culturally significant crop cultivation, and how um, unsettling it was to recognize that these patterns are not so different from the way that white settlers have also transformed environments for their own use. And there's differences in power and in scale, but there's also these kind of unsettling reminders, right? And so part of this is coming to this uh, to reconcile this reality that whiteness is a product of settler colonialism, not its fundamental cause. It did not precede settler colonialism, and that non-white people can and do take part in settler colonialism, including in settler colonial societies where they are not the dominant group, right? And again, there's a talk in this series by Candice Fujikani, who's a great scholar talking about Asian settler colonialism in the context of Hawaii. And there's many others who have pointed out that Asian Americans also take part in settler colonialism. And Heidi Minhong, who is the next speaker in the series, who you should definitely tune in to hear in 2 days, I believe, writes, amid the material legacies of environmental violence, a decompositional method enables us to re-examine settler ecological practices to outline possibilities for ecological relation that restore solidarities with native sovereignty movements and other more than human beings. Against the violence of colonialism that remakes land and reifies human non-human hierarchies, decomposition enables an Asian American environmental relationality that is more deeply attuned to the land as an archive of decay and communal regeneration, right? So it's not just thinking about how do we sustain ourselves, but also what do we do when it's time for, our projects and our personal lives, our collective lives to also give way to new lives in the future. And so in farming, there is a concept of a cover crop, which is something that you plant in order to restore nutrients to the soil and that you eventually return to the soil by kind of discarding without necessarily harvesting. And for me, I thought there would be an interesting kind of analogy here where we as Asian American farmers engaging in this kind of cultural reclamation and important like immediate food sovereignty work to provide for our communities can start to think of ourselves also as a cover crop with relation to indigenous sovereignty. And so to become a cover crop, we have to adopt new modes of belonging in which we identify ourselves not as claimants, inheritors, or even sovereigns, but rather as collaborators in the intercommunal, as in collaborating with other communities as well, right? Black and Indigenous communities, project of rewilding. To be a cover crop is to declare our intent to give back right where we are, to return nutrients to this soil rather than some far off place. It is an acceptance of the transitory nature of our occupation and a commitment to giving way to other ecocultural futures at the end of our life cycle. And so part of this means like not aspiring for permanence and not aspiring for Asian America to exist forever and for our food systems and for our kind of cultures to have a permanent place here. So some of the takeaways that I had more broadly is that, first of all, we have to humanize our ancestors. When we're speaking of ancestral knowledge, we should also ask, which ancestors are we referring to? Living during what times and in which places? As diasporic peoples, we must remember that traditions of place-based knowledges, not just land-based, but place-based knowledges, develop through interactions with local conditions. And we must scrutinize whether or not the ways of relating to environments in the quote-unquote homeland are appropriate for our present environments. Most of all, we must humanize our ancestors rather than reduce them to caricatures of timeless and omniscient wisdom. Our ancestors did not have all of the answers for addressing the issues of their times, and certainly do not have all the answers for the unprecedented social and ecological calamities that we face today. We can look to our predecessors for guidance, but not for salvation, right? We have to think about them as human beings who faced certain challenges and had specific conditions, rather than just the source of fixing all of the things that we're facing today. And so Caitlin Reed talks also about how land itself is a settler colonial construct, in that Native peoples have a spiritual relationship to the entire biosphere, not just the land. However, colonialism separates land from the rest of creation as a marker of territorial expansion. And so for us who are doing quote unquote land-based work, we have to be critical of this kind of back to the land romanticism that is rooted in settler colonialism as we practice food sovereignty and as we try to build out ways to meet the needs of our own communities. And part of this means envisioning food sovereignty beyond agrarianism being the kind of sedentary farming that is common to many Asian cultures, but that is not necessarily common to the indigenous ways of subsisting off of the environments here. And so there is ways of kind of interacting with, the forests and with the waterways that exceed just sedentary farming, right? And so we also have to center bioregionalism, which is this idea that different places have distinct ecosystems and kind of living communities based on their geography, based on their climate, and honor indigenous territorial and ecocultural sovereignty in our own efforts to practice agroecology. And part of this is recognizing that ancestral wisdom is not the same as indigenous wisdom, and that like our ancestral wisdom, specifically as diasporic people, may be indigenous to one place, but is not going to be indigenous everywhere, right? Indigeneity is a relationship, it is not an inherent kind of identity. And also that agroecology, this aspiration for us to practice food systems and food production based in an ecological relationship cannot be divorced from the greater ecosystem that we find ourselves in, right? Like it cannot just be the plot that we are farming where we have, polycultures and different plants that interact with each other. Agroecology has to keep in mind that we are embedded within larger ecosystems that have developed over thousands and millions of years of different plants forming symbiotic relationships of pollinators, of rocks, of soil, of water, all of these things coming together to create that present landscape. And that while it is possible for plants to naturalize and to build symbiotic relationships in environments that they are not native to, that cannot be assumed, right? That has to be something that is measured, and that has to be something that is recognized by both the native ecosystems and the life that has pre-existed the kind of arrivants, and also by those arrivants and their intentions to practice that kind of relationship. And so finally, the quote that I want to end on from another collaborator is, how do I want to be a thoughtful descendant while also being a thoughtful settler? Kinship is alive now, not something to be replicated from a time that is not now. I'm here now, and I am here as a product of all of these ruptures. So thank you very much for listening to my spiel. So I have for now, and we can open up for Q&A as well. Yeah. Isa, if you want to share.
Hi. Sorry, let me turn on my camera. First of all, literally I'm just like so blown away by that. That was quite possibly one of the most profound and beautiful things like I've heard in a long time. Um, and I think part of that is because like I'm Filipino and my mother's side comes from a long line of like farmers, but we aren't indigenous Filipinos. So I think after what you had like discussed, I was kind of like, are we products as well of like taking modes of farming and seeds and like commodifying it, even though we aren't really like settler colonialists in like our own land. But then I think about that when we bring that to the States as well. And I don't know, I just have a lot of thoughts of how like community is found in farming and these like, little arrow gardens that people make to try and like reconnect. But then I don't know, I just have so many complicated thoughts. It's not really a question. I'm kind of just like, wow, you got my brain thinking even more after I just got off a 9 to 5. Like, but in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, I love that. I think I have thought through a lot of these same things as well. And I think that the things I want to tease out here, the first one for me is I think there is such an important recognition that history didn't start with like white colonization, right? That there has been histories before that and processes of change in our homelands, processes of colonization in our homelands that preceded that, and that also the future is going to involve change. And that like one of the things I think about is there's this assumption I think from a lot of especially second generation folks that like our communities have to persist as they arrived or even before they arrived in these lands, and that that is our authenticity, that that is the way of like moving forward is by reclaiming the past. And I think that there are elements of that that are important, and especially the transition period, but there's also this recognition that the violence of assimilation in this country has been based on this power imbalance of white supremacy, but having to adapt to a new environment is actually something that all life has to do, right? And there are some ways in which adapting to indigenous ecosystems, indigenous foodways is actually part of the path of liberation for our own communities as well, right? How do we recognize that our foodways, that our cultures do have to recognize the cultures that were here before them and how they were adapted to the landscape. And that doesn't mean accepting what America or what kind of white colonialism tells us to assimilate into, but it means coming into close proximity and deep relationship with folks who have stewarded lands before us and who have shown how to live on these lands well, not just in the kind of like techniques they use, but actually like what are they eating and how are they producing it? And how do we think about our food systems eventually evolving to kind of take into account the ways that these lands need to be stewarded. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
No, thank you. Literally, thank you.
Yeah, I see a question from Christy in the chat that I'll read out loud. So it says, I love the point you made about resisting the romanticism of return to the land type narratives. I'm curious what that would look like in practice. How do we stay connected with their ecologies in an urban environment as settlers? Yeah, I think a really big part for me of that was something that I took from Caitlin Reed's analysis in settler cannabis, which is that it's not just about relationships to land as this abstract thing, but it's relationships to place. And so, like, these land projects can't just treat any piece of land as just like a site to build on top of. Um, and I think about this too in the way that sometimes we do like land acknowledgements and we talk about a lot of times people talk about their land acknowledgement as I am on blank and blank territory. Like if I were to do San Francisco, a lot of people say like I am on the traditional homelands of Ramaytush Ohlone territory. And for me, there's a kind of conflict there because it puts the present on like on top of the past as if like indigenous stewardship has ended, as if indigenous people are in the past. And also you wouldn't say that for places. Like you wouldn't say I'm on San Francisco. You would say I'm in San Francisco. And if you were like talking about even the United States, people don't say I'm on the United States. You say you're in the United States because you recognize that that's a whole kind of world. And so for me, it's more appropriate for us to talk about like I'm in Ramaytush territory in a place world that has been changed drastically by settler colonialism, but is still something that you inhabit. And so when you're doing land projects intentionally and especially in urban environments, it's about thinking about not just land, but what is the kind of ecosystem and the lives and the elements and all the things that structure your belonging in a place, rather than just being on something. I think that's what the back to the land movements really fail to see, is that they just see land as this kind of site for building their own kind of utopian projects upon and fantasies. And gentrification operates in the same way, right? Like gentrification is this fantasy of being able to build on top of. Um, and so for me, at least, that's how I navigate that kind of relationship. And that's easier said than done, but it's, I think, a orientation that helps guide. Yeah.
I have a quick question for you, Duan
Mhm.
Jian.
Go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, so before this talk, we'd actually discussed a little bit of how recent kind of the federal kind of policies and changes have impacted Asian American farmers and stewards on many different levels. So if you could kind of touch on that.
Yeah, it was wild as I was doing this research because I concluded all of my kind of site visits and interviews. And with the Trump administration taking office, there were a number of kind of changes, especially with Doge and the federal cuts that directly impacted some of these institutions I was talking about before, like networks. And one of that is there was huge cuts to local procurement programs, and these were federal funding, especially to school district and such, that provided money for schools to get food from local farmers in their areas. And that was a huge source of revenue for a lot of these small scale sustainable operations, as opposed to like huge multinational agribusiness, whatever. Um, and so that is still ongoing. There's like all these lawsuits too about funding stops and whatnot. And even like another big area that was targeted was farmer education and training programs. So some folks I know in this room are connected with Agricology Commons. They lost like $300,000, $400,000, something like that in a grant, and we're like spotlighted on the USDA like Instagram and like all these different places of like we're fighting DEI, like we're fighting woke farming, whatever, like all this kind of stuff. Because places that advertise that they're kind of training up young, like BIPOC farmers are trying to do kind of these food systems and especially like food sovereignty or food justice based work have been really pummeled by the administration. And I think that one of the things that brings me kind of a silver lining like of hope is places like Choi Commons that are really, really thinking about this logistically and investing in cooperative infrastructure, right? So business cooperatives, logistic cooperatives, where they're still in many ways supported by federal funding or nonprofit kind of funding, but they're trying to gear more towards community-based agriculture, like CSA, but also not just CSAs as individual farms, but kind of pooling those resources, pooling like the knowledge, pooling the customer like base, pooling the transportation, like all this kind of stuff, and like really, even regardless of the Trump administration, that was going to be necessary because small scale sustainable agriculture is not financially viable in this economy. Agriculture, even big business agriculture, is like struggling right now in the United States because automation has cheapened the price of food to such a significant degree, right? And part of this is also kind of a like sideways or kind of wild take, but I think part of the problem with our food system is that a lot of the cost of living in the United States has been warped, where things like food are supposedly extremely cheap, although there's like manufactured scarcity and a lot of cost delivered that way. But like the food produced by farmers is sold at such a cheap price because of automation, while other things like housing, which should be free, are like extremely expensive. And I think in an ideal world, like in the case of a lot of our ancestral cultures, like food is relatively expensive. It is like cost the it is time and labor intensive and takes up a lot of people's energy to produce. And I think that there is a kind of balance where we need to move back towards food actually being something that takes a lot of our energy and takes a lot of our labor to produce well. That's what some sort of like kind of sustainable organic agriculture is about. I listened to this lecture from this scholar once who, and I'll remember the name eventually, but who talked about how the energy transition, like the green transition, that energy actually has to come from human energy as well. It's not just about finding the next technology to replace oil and like going to solar and like just, you know, um, still expending as much energy as we do, and doing the same things that we're doing with technology, like AI, all that bullshit. Like it's not just about that. and just switching what's the power source. It's actually we have to return our own labor towards our lives, and we have to be involved and deeply in connection with um, yeah, life forms beyond ourselves. And that is what part of these projects are doing, right? And it's remembering that that's also localized. And this is what I'm talking about. Like kinship is also about devotion and about how much time we spend with each other. And when you're producing food, there's this expectation. It's not just to kind of produce as much as possible at the lowest cost, but it's actually to figure out these things are important to us. They deserve the kind of dignity and respect of investing our time and energy into it. Um, yeah, I want to answer also this question that Huiling posted in the chat about decomposition and like thinking about home is also a place that we die and not just where we live. And I actually got a lot of that because of a conversation I had with Robin, who unfortunately isn't here, but is also kind of the steward of the Amato Kaya initiative. Where Robin was talking to me about her own kids and about the future of Filipino diaspora organizing and how like a lot of us in the diaspora have focused a lot of our energy on the homelands and thinking about how to transform the conditions there, but have to recognize that like most of us are going to die here. And like there is like a very kind of profound realization in that like we have to think about what do we leave behind, both in the legacies of organizing work, but also like in physical form too, right? Like we are made up of the land that first for like many of us our ancestors come from and like generations of living in certain ecologies that have created the nutrients that build our bones, our DNA, and all of that. But also here too, like we have been nurtured by the water and by the light and by like the nutrients from these places, and those nutrients have to return somehow because under our current agricultural system, um, you grow plants in a certain place and crops, and then they're shipped off somewhere far away, and the nutrients don't return back to that place, and so it erodes the soil, and it throws into imbalance those natural cycles of elemental cycling of all that. Um, and when we're thinking about being in the diaspora, like a lot of that kind of severance is also, it's not just alienation from like the cultures and the quote unquote people and like the languages that we consider to be our home, but it's also an alienation from those landscapes and from the nutrients. And the solution I don't think is as simple as like we all just need to go back to where we come from again, because like so many of us have mixed heritage, so many of us are not actually from one place or another. But it's figuring out how do we adapt to be able to give back to the places that we are in, and how do we actually deeply deeply anchor ourselves um, in building a future where we are, rather than just running away and rather than putting all of the things that we've accumulated um, into another place. And this is something that's difficult. It's something that like the scope of especially AI and automation is pushing against, is to delocalize our social networks, our economic networks. One of the things that I think about is that our sites of resistance and our sites of building like the new world are actually very different today. The sites of resistance are often like global, they're international, there's like transnational finance capital, there's like these tech, fascists and all that kind of stuff that have, spread across the globe. But the places that we want to build the new worlds in are actually local. They're the places immediately around us with the communities that we see every day, that bring our food and our electricity and our housing and the people that are right around us. And we have to keep those differences in mind so that we don't get lost in one or the other, that we don't try to build a world that is, not rooted in place, and so that we don't fight the people who are right next to us, right?
Another question for you. You discussed a little bit about your research and kind of the connections that you made during that. If there's one thing that you could kind of expand on, if you could go back to doing your research or like doing a whole other project, what kind of topic do you think would be that one you would be interested in doing, or two, that would be really relevant and speaks to the issues happening today?
Yeah. Ooh, okay. The thing that are happening today, that's a harder one. I'm gonna go with just the very first part of your question about like what would I want to dive into deeper. If I had like, yeah, more time and also I think a stronger knowledge base. There's some really cool stuff happening in geosciences of like measuring indigenous, um, like, and I know that there's some contradictions already there, but like of measuring indigenous relationships to land. And so there's like geoscience experiments that look at how indigenous folks and in specific places, like their practices of both like fire restoration, but even their practices of like growing food in a certain place, like how those nutrient cycles actually work in that place. There's also kind of similar studies on like how non-native species change the landscapes they're in, and how they change the soil chemistry and how they change the rate at which certain nutrients are taken up and returned to the system. And I think it would be really important to look at, and this is such like a niche topic for me, but like Asian diasporic crops are like interacting with the soil on a chemical level. Like what is going on with like bok choy or ampalaya or, like upo or whatever, like why, like what does it mean for example, like Southeast Asian tropical crops to be in the Central Valley of California, and what do they do to the soil there? Given that there's such a very, like there is such a like world of difference in the native kind of like geographies and climates and how the rates of metabolism in those native ecosystems actually function. I would love to like geek out about like what's actually going on there with like carbon and phosphorus and like nitrogen, but maybe an experiment for another lifetime.
Yeah, thank you so much, Finjan. And a similar question in the chat. There, another guest was curious about how you came to the subject that you already studied, and I know that's a little super broad, but maybe you can discuss a little bit about that.
Yeah, it came up because I started farming and I was at like an Asian American diasporic farm, and it was a super eye-opening and empowering and like euphoric experience, of me feeling like I had found my people and that I had found um, the purpose that I want to dedicate like my time to and things like that. Um, and the farm experienced a lot of challenges over the years, but also in addition to that, I started to have like these questions of how deep the kind of relationships I had to land were as we started to get into these bigger questions of agroecology and building relationship to land, and like me taking stock of the fact that like what my ancestors ate and like what produced my DNA and all that kind of stuff were not actually rooted in this land, and that the way that other people had practiced relationship to land looked very different, even as I felt like this was right, like it felt so right to me. And I think I still hold both those tensions. Like I think that that joy and the love I have for this work is also what motivates the critique, right? And there was one instance too where I had been doing this kind of exposure trip in Seattle and talking with Native folks there, and a Duwamish elder talked about how they practice tree burials, where their folks, when they pass, are returned to the forest and like first put in the tree branches and then returned to the ground. And they talk about how like these trees are not just like our surroundings and our neighbors or like even another people. Like these are our ancestors. Our ancestors are in these trees, and these trees also like give us the nutrients that produce our bodies, and like we are in this kind of deeply like symbiotic intertwined relationship. And I was like, wow, I definitely don't have that here. Like that's not even like the beginning of, right? And it's not this aspiration to like, oh, like we need to, there's like kind of a interesting, very thought-provoking but controversial chapter in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Braiding Sweetgrass about like becoming native, that a lot of people have taken a lot of different directions. And I'm kind of also going to speak to this comment in the chat about like non-native species like eucalyptus, right? Of like, can non-native species become native? I'm not the person to answer that question, but I also again like have to reiterate my like thinking that like that has to be something that's mutually recognized, right? Like that's something that cannot just be like proclaimed by non-native like people of like the intention to indigenize, the intention to belong to a place, but it's like in order for relationships to be symbiotic, there has to be consent, there has to be mutualism from both parties, acknowledging that this actually is a symbiotic relationship that benefits both parties, and thinking how do we, as much as possible, like approach that relationship.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions and for the presentation. We still have 5 minutes left for the Q&A. Are there any other lingering kind of issues that people in the chat want to share before we lose Duan Jian for the rest of forever? Actually, one quick question for you. What was your favorite part of doing the research and connecting with each farmer? Like, what was yeah, so my question would be twofold: is what was the most interesting part, and two, um, sorry, let me rephrase that. Interesting and maybe favorite moments or favorite moments of doing the research that you've been doing.
Yeah, but like it's not even close, but like building the relationships and friendships with the farmers along the way. Love you, Michiko. Like meeting people who like I was like when I was this was for an undergraduate senior thesis, like original or like not just original, like this was about undergraduate thesis for me, but I was kind of like, how do I just explain that like these friendships are actually like the most important part of this? Like, yes, I can write it all out, but actually just meeting these people and staying in community and thinking about like how yeah abundant like the practice of continuing to ask these questions in community because again like I also want to say that like a lot of these questions and conclusions not just actually all of the conclusions came through the responses of the folks I worked with, but a lot of the questions too were things that folks were already thinking about and had brought up as I made my rounds like talking to different folks across the so-called United States, right? And so this project would not exist without those people, and also like the most gratifying, the most cathartic elements were discovering that other people also are wrestling with these things, and especially people who are daily like engaged with the practice of trying to grow food in a sustainable and just way.
Awesome, love that. And another question from chat. How do we be like mycelium and create ongoing spaces to have these conversations in addition to this wonderful space?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go back to the idea that like we have to bring this locally. Like I'm really grateful for opportunities like AKI to project this outwards, but I think that the most important work is actually with the folks who are in your direct ecosystems, with folks who are doing the food kind of systems work in your area, and also about all of us in our respective areas, learning about what are the indigenous ecosystems and what are the ways that people have cared for each other, the land, their lives that kind of exist within these ecosystems in those places, and that there's not going to be a one size fit all solution. And even like the networks that we build, like one of the things I'm wary of but also like cautiously supportive of with things like second generation seeds is that they connect people across really vast areas who would never have otherwise been able to put in contact. And like the pandemic was such a huge catalyst for people, for especially Asian American farmers, getting in touch with one another because of so much remote platforms for doing so. And we have to remember that our work will look different based on our local conditions. And that has to be at the center of all of it. Like there is a question for me of what does it mean to ship seeds across the country? And like what does it mean for us to bring seeds transnationally? Like are those responsible in terms of ecological and like social justice interests when those seeds have adapted for certain places? And like even trying to create those seeds to adapt in the new places like brings up questions to me about power and about indigenous sovereignty and what is like the territorial um, boundaries of the food systems that we're trying to create and who gets to decide um, in the end what those look like. So for me, yeah, again, it's like about building those networks out, but remembering what the work looks like locally with the folks who are in your immediate ecosystems.
Thank you so much again for answering all these questions. In our last minute, what is the last thing that you want to like kind of impart to the guests before we leave tonight?
In part is so dramatic. I think like like curious, stay engaged with this. Bring your own questions to these conversations. And I think like so much of the work is about evaluation and about not disengagement when things get hard, but about moving through the tensions by bringing them up with ourselves, with each other, trying to, yeah, work through these conflicts and contradictions so that we can get towards a refined sense of like what is our purpose and how do we actualize it. And also, I think with the part about like that like authenticity is relative and that like I think there's also a danger of getting too arbitrary and just being like, oh, there's nothing we can do because like everything is relative. I like very much want to avoid leaving that as like a final message and us finding criteria for talking about like what does justice look like, and that food sovereignty is an immediate need for so many of our communities, right? Like we do have to be able to produce the food for our communities and transition that long arc towards decomposition, rather than like stop doing all that we're doing because it's not perfect, right? Like we have to move through it and we have to continually engage and re-engage and criticize like both our own actions and the actions of others so that we can work towards an approximation of what it means to build the world that we want to live in.
Again, thank you so much, both for the presentation, for this Q&A, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today and asked questions as well. Y'all are superstars for supporting us with the series and also wanting to learn about Indigenous solidarity and sovereignty, right? Because these are issues that are going to continue long after this series. And especially with what's going on the presidential level, we definitely want to make sure that we're supporting our communities in a way that's meaningful and doesn't perpetuate settler colonialism, right? So to close off this series, just another reminder, we will be uploading the recording of this lecture and the accompanying resource list, which will have all of the links to all the resources that Duan Jian has mentioned throughout today. And so make sure to follow us on our socials. Follow Duan Jian on Instagram at, what is your handle?
I think this is my current one.
Duan Jian is correct. I love that. I love that so much. But we will also share all of this after, yes. So make sure to follow us, etc. And thank y'all so much. We still have a couple more speakers in June, so check those dates out and appreciate y'all. Take care. Adios.